Um,
I mean, the Venus, Mars, Pluto conjunction is certainly easy to see in action on the world stage right now.
yeah.
But I would be curious. Uh, I don't know if that's a good place to start, but I'd be curious, Chad, just to hear your sense of like. Um, I mean, Uranus is in there too, of course, with the square. But how do you see Venus playing into this dynamic right now? I mean, is that like the camaraderie of the Ukrainians or something and resisting, or like what ways do you see it coming through? And I'd be curious, you too, Ashton, how you see that. But yeah,
Yeah, like definitely the camaraderie that you're describing, and the love for the Ukrainian people, and um, but I also think like before this was moving into what was, I had a feeling he was actually going to invade, and on some, what's interesting is there actually can be like a love Venus of war with the Venus Mars. I mean, it often comes through, in just like dynamic interplay, erotic tension, and like creative dynamism, like dancing and enjoying life and creative art, and in all sorts of levels. But at the same time, you can see like a love for debate or love for the like hashing it out, like in a Mars type of way. And when Pluto is involved, Mars Pluto energy is very likely to have to open up the depths of the unconscious and the will to power, and Venus can be that too. It can be like the love of power. Um,
mm.
and so, yeah, but I think there's also a Jupiter Neptune conjunction, which that really feels like the heart chakra, like the love opening, like Jupiter expanding the Neptunian compassion that, the world is, like holding space for the Ukrainians and just recognizing that, the suffering that's going on. But underneath it all is the Saturn square Uranus, which is really tight right now. And will be throughout the rest of the year through January, at least, of 2023. It actually comes back a little bit in October of 2023 as well. But that's just like the destabilization that's happening, like, the foundational structures of Ukraine in particular, but even the world economy potentially, like if they have more sanctions. I mean, I guess the last sanctions they're holding out on are, their
Oil.
gas
Yeah.
supply. Yeah. And so if that were to happen, I've heard like $200 barrel oil prices potentially, and it just like that type of infrastructure destabilization is very much a Saturn Uranus. Economies tend to go through breakdowns and stuff during
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot at play, and particularly if you look at Putin's chart, which we won't go into now, but in the sequence of events, I mean, it actually starts with the Moscow apartment bombings in like '99. Do you guys know about that? I mean,
No,
like
I'm trying to
basically,
get caught up on Eastern European and Russian history in the last couple of days, but there's so much that I don't know.
yeah, I mean, he actually had a false flag operation where they bombed, FSB bombed three or four apartment buildings in September of '99. And the last one, they it failed, and they discovered the bombs before they went off, and it was the FSB who had planted them. And but at that point, after three or bombings had already taken place, the Russian public was all behind Putin, and this is right before he got elected. This is like Yeltsin Putin transfer, and he rose to power on a false flag operation of killing his own citizens. And then he ended up bombing Grozny because he blamed it on Chechen terrorists, and he ended up just destroying Grozny and being elected on that wave. And Saturn was on his Jupiter Pluto. He has a Jupiter Pluto alignment, and that's his ambition and stuff. And Saturn was square to Pluto. And then there's a sequence like in 2008. That's when NATO like invited basically Ukraine into, I mean, they said, we're laying the groundwork for you guys to come into NATO.
Right.
And that was a bridge that Putin had already said, don't do. And then in 2014, Saturn was opposite where it was in 99, again, square his Pluto when he invaded Ukraine and the revolution happened. And there was like a soft coup with, Brennan went there,
Yeah.
CIA and stuff, and they said, we want these guys to come into power.
Right.
And then now, like basically the last 2 years from the Saturn Pluto conjunction during the pandemic, it was square to Putin's Mercury Neptune conjunction. And he's been isolated, and like the Pluto Mercury is like the paranoia, like it intensifies the mercurial imagination with Neptune, and in dark ways potentially, or obsessive ways with Pluto. And then what's happening right now is Saturn moved out of the conjunction with Pluto, but it's moving back into the alignment with his natal Pluto. Saturn is opposing Putin's natal Pluto again. Like, so it's on the same axis from 99 to 2014 to now. So for the next year, Saturn's going to oppose his Pluto. And it's the second perinatal matrix, the Saturn-Pluto complex, second and third. And it's the feeling of no exit, like that's what's happening in his mind, is NATO's encroaching and he's feeling like he is getting trapped, and he's reacting because of that, and so the sanctions and all that just make it worse. I mean, he's going to feel more and more isolated. That, like, did you see Hans Gord Mueller's thing on the pariah principle?
Yeah, I did. We watched it. Me and Ashton watched it. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't. I didn't watch it.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, maybe I told you about it.
Okay.
Sorry, I imagined that. I saw it.
I watched this of them together.
Yeah, and he makes really good points. I think, I mean, Putin's basically a psychopath. He has a Mars trine Pluto in his natal chart, and it's easy for him to kill people. I mean, he seems to enjoy it. He seems, he's a bloodthirsty murderer. But the pariah aspect, it's interesting. Like, I'm in the religion and human evolution class again, and like the egalitarian nature of the hunter-gatherer, like for 200,000 years, that's what we were. And the way that we held space was whenever there was a warrior upstart, the males would get together in like a moral collective sense, and we would isolate pariah, the warrior upstart.
Right.
Yeah, Ashton's in this class too. So like, we would, isolate them. And if they kept going, if they kept with their warrior nature and wanting to dominate and despotism, we'd kill them. But it was a way, it's called reverse dominance hierarchy, so like, and that's democracy, is a reverse dominance hierarchy. It's like the will of the group dominating the potential despot. And that's clearly like more resonant with the deep nature of the Homo sapien, like versus like the brief despotism. I mean, brief in the sense of just the last 10,000 years or something. We went into like chiefdoms and archaic kingdoms, and stuff. But like for 250,000 years, we were egalitarian, and now it seems like the United States, French Revolution, end of World War II, democracy and individual sovereignty and individual rights and the will of the people has been the trajectory of the West. I mean, that is the container within which Putin is a warrior upstart, and like, but how far are we willing to go? Are we gonna, we've made him a pariah, but are we going to, go through with it? And like, I mean,
He's a pariah with nukes.
Exactly, 1,000 nuclear weapons, so
we don't want to corner him so that he feels there is no other option,
right.
But I also think there's like the Western values, which are toward democracy and individualism, aren't yet and might never really be the truly world centric, in the sense that China and Russia to some extent, and India and like the global South kind of might not fully view what we see in the West as universal, as
agree. Yeah.
universal, there are plenty of examples of, non-Western countries who are like, yes, we do want democracy, and yes, we do want this sort of individual freedom. But I just feel like we're still like, there are multiple civilizations on the planet right now that have a very different vision of what the human is and what our purpose is. And
Right.
Putin and the philosophers around him, like Dugin, Alexander Dugin, but others too. Gary Lachman just did a great interview on Rebel Wisdom about Russia's sort of millenarian, apocalyptic religious
I see that. Interesting.
ideology, which and this conservative sense of upholding traditional values that the West, with its obsession from Putin's point of view with LGBTQ and trans stuff and the wokeness and all of that.
Do you think it's that Putin?
Putin and the philosophers around him, his
Okay.
advisors, are threatened by that whole Western cultural complex that's championing individual freedom over, more conservative traditional values, which involve the strong patriarch and the sense of, being a member of one's social body in a way that takes precedence over individual desires and wants and everything. So it's just it's a totally different value system. And I'm not trying to be a relativist. I think there's something, we at least have to acknowledge that aspect of human nature that does want to be free, and that liberal democracies are more or less centered around. But I also think maybe we can't just dismiss the collective, communal sense of social embeddedness that liberal democracies are not so good at recognizing. Not that I'm not trying to both sides it here. I'm just saying there's different values at play, and Putin really does feel threatened by liberal values, and the elites in Russia, at least. I think there's clearly at least a sizable minority of Russian citizens who are trying to get liberal freedom and individual rights and all of that. But it's just a more traditional society too.
Right. Yeah. And that's also the Saturn square Uranus, like Uranus is freedom, Saturn is the conservative, and that's ripe throughout our culture as well. It's, the protest movements and stuff that are happening, very much that freedom versus, totalitarian mandates and constraints and all that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a dicey moment. And yeah, the values are up for debate, yeah, so it's a fascinating
debate would be good if we could do it verbally,
Right.
It's always this challenge with, especially with international politics, but increasingly, I mean, so many Western democracies are losing any sense of social cohesion and splitting at the center and spiraling into civil war and stuff. So, but like, how do we maintain disagreement in the context of a shared desire for like peace and coexistence? And how do we not spiral into violence and just sheer force, right? Just brute force as the means of expressing what we want instead of rationality,
Yeah, ultimately, what's interesting about the religion and evolution class, it's basically the moral aspect of community and ritual and stuff of like what's the overarching mythology or narrative that guides a civilization that holds space for them ultimately. And that's kind of what's lost in the West is the death of God, and there is no overarching meta narrative that holds the continuum, that gives us some type of cohesion, so that it becomes easy that, or not necessarily easy, but likely in some level that force would emerge as the way to, take control and power again,
Yeah.
so
I
that
mean,
kind of,
yeah.
well, go ahead. What are you gonna say?
Well, I mean, it could go either way. Like, I was thinking of Charles Taylor and how he describes the modern and postmodern periods as being confined to an immanent frame without any source of transcendent
Right.
value or morality.
Right.
And sometimes people that have a sense of transcendent morality would go to war to defend it against people they felt were relativistic or didn't respect the transcendent value,
Right.
So
Right.
because an immanent frame, as Taylor describes it, basically leaves value up to the private individual. Like you decide,
Interesting, right? Well, I think it's hopefully more of a collective agreement that's ultimately forged. And this kind of actually leads right into what I want to talk about, I think. So do you, like, I guess I can
share your slides.
screen. Let's see, let me, oh wait, oh shoot. All right, I messed up my screen for a second.
That's all right.
There we go.
I think as co-host, you can get the screen share, right?
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
Cool. So.
Dialogos.
Cool. You guys can see it okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've been listening to VERVAEKE, and I feel like a lot of what he's asking for, I pulled a couple of quotes off of, like, I think it's the third episode of The Meaning Crisis, and I feel like what he's he's reaching for a meta narrative, like he's reaching for something that can satisfy the meaning crisis, and I have a feeling that archetypal astrology can do that, and a few other things. So, like, he says, how do we salvage the ability to cultivate wisdom, self-transcendence, enhance meaning, overcome self-deception, and realize in relation to the transcendent who we are and what the world is? And, like, the natal chart provides that. I mean, it is an instantiation of wisdom. Like, it's a reflection of the unconscious, of dimension of who we are, and it connects to the transcendent dimension of self, the self that's connected to the whole, and it clearly enhances meaning. And the capacity to overcome self-deception is in the reflective process with engaging with one's natal chart, but then also in relationship to other people. It's not like you can just do it yourself. Like, it's why you get readings, and we do it collectively. We can see each other's charts, and we can we can, in dialogue, recognize how we are embodying them. And in the same way we hold space for each other without astrology, you can do it with an extra frame of reference, ultimately, that can help us understand, like, how we are embodying, how we are participating in the archetypal dynamics of our natal chart, and whether it's living up to shared standards and stuff. I mean, and he's relevance realization. I think that's what I was just describing. Like, there's a way in which what we're doing can be, you can use the archetypal planetary positions as a relevance third position that allows for in Cosmos and Psyche, where Rick lists the figures who have the Uranus opposition: Newton, Freud, Galileo. When Uranus is opposite of Rosa Parks, that, like, the significant event that they have in life that they bring to the table is some significant aspect that, like, it's a capacity to do some type of relevance realization from a neutral perspective. Like, does it align? Do we recognize these alignments with the lived experience of people as being relevant? Is it a way to hone in a realized understanding? and mythologies have to be livable. He says, I'm just taking quotes. He's like, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you can practice, tell me how you can live with the myths, you know? And it's like, that's what the actual transit practice is like living in relationship and, you know, recognizing how you are participating in your natal chart and in your transits, and doing the work, you know, the same way we do self-reflective practices. You're doing it with the aid of that neutral kind of perspective. And he actually points towards Charles Taylor's disembedding, you know, from the movement out of the axial. And, you know, he says, how do we re-embed without losing everything we've gained in the disembedding? You know, like Rick is like, you know, the forging of the autonomous self, and how much we cherish that differentiation that's taken place, and not being, you know, beholden to the gods and goddesses the way we were prior to the Copernican revolution. You know, astrology was just like kind of governing our fates, and we were at the mercy of the gods. And now we've, you know, had more of a closure of that autonomy, the buffered self, as Taylor describes. And we're no longer, you know, we have more agency to engage with them. And then, you know, ultimately, the discovery of the 3 outer planets are key to fulfilling, you know, the final picture. And even Pluto, you know, wasn't discovered until 1930. But like, so like, we'll get there in a second. He says, how do we reconcile the two worlds? How do we live with or recover the legacy of the axial revolution, which we can no longer inhabit that worldview? And, you know, the archetypal dimension is a recovery of the enchanted perspective. I mean, it realizes that the myths, again, in a new way, but, you know, in a way that sees, it recovers both the sacred dimension of the cosmos and of ourselves, but at the same time with the buffered self that's been forged, you know, that we don't lose that in the process. It gains a new capacity ultimately. And then, you know, I've just dived into EASTMAN'S work. So I was really struck by the last video and how much Epperson and even EASTMAN, they were pointing towards archetypes. Like the way Epperson was describing eternal objects, he was saying like how they're participatory, how they're what allows for novelty to take place. And but so anyway, this is just from the book. And he says the way of numbers is one way of, you know, how do we quantify or understand reality? We have numbers focus on context, independence, and quantitative representation, as some have claimed theories of everything, which often presume science-only approach, but also including the way of signs. And the semiotics, that's like the meaning that we are able to decipher, that we're able to interpret in that relational frame. And on, you know, we can recognize the planetary alignments as, you know, the geometry of the solar system as number. You know, it's an empirical aspect that we all agree upon, the mathematics of where the planets are, where our transits are. And, you know, and on some level, just even the archetypal dimension of the numbers themselves, of like conjunction is 1, opposition is 2, trine is 3, 4 is a square. I mean, these are just basic Platonic archetypes, you know, but it also is a semiotic relationship. It's the signs as well. And so he says a much less restricted framing would be one associated with humanistic studies, the way of context, roughly the domain of arts and humanities, fully affirming qualitative dimensions that in turn also include semiotics. So this, I think, is in Cosmos and Psyche. I mean, that's basically what he's done in the archetypal historiography. It's just, it is the humanities. It is like what we were doing, the arts and our participation, the subjective quality of human experience. But the brilliance in Cosmos and Psyche is it's cultural history, not, I mean, there's some individual biography, but like it has much more of an objective perspective. It allows for more of an objective perspective rather than just Nietzsche's own psyche, you know, or that type of thing, which he does discuss. But, you know, when you're seeing it on broad scales, it has, I think, more of a collective resonance and collective perspective that's engendered there. And so the same thing, the geometrical alignments, semiotics, the meaning, archetypal multivalence. And then finally, what is it actually pointing towards is, you know, the transcendent. I mean, the numinous, the gods and goddesses, eternal objects, or the archetypes, or the anima mundi can all be, I think, understood as the third context that Eastman is like pointing towards. And like, this is from also, I like, forget exactly, it's page 45. I forget where, I'm just cracking into this book, but it says correlations of potentia can enable the coherence of physical relations as observed at astronomical scales, the principle of universality. Among human systems, such coordination could even help us understand evidence for archetypal phenomena. You know, this is Harold Ottmansbacher and Christopher Fuchs, which like Ottmansbacher is, you know, working with Jung and synchronicity, and like, I imagine that's what he's pointing towards here. And like that statement just completely leaped out at me. You know, he's clearly like pointing to the capacity of potentially quantifying in some way archetypal phenomena, you know, or in a sense measuring. And I think archetypal astrology does that. It has a quantificational dimension because of the planetary alignments and the orbs that we recognize as being operative for when you're likely to see a concentration of archetypal phenomena associated with the planets. So this is where I really want to open it up to you guys, is just like, you know, to me, astrology seems to be indicating what Barfield and Steiner is saying is a spiritual science. Like, it's a science of relating to the anima mundi, to, you know, the soul of the world, to the archetypes, and Barfield describing it as final participation is, you know, something that like I was saying before, like we had to differentiate towards the autonomous self and discover the three outer planets. Like Jung was using astrology with all of his clients up in the last 20 years of his career, but he wasn't using Pluto because it wasn't discovered until 30, and they didn't have enough understanding of it. But Pluto is crucial. Like it's the depth of the human unconscious. I mean, it's the Freudian id, it's the instincts. Like, you don't understand the world wars, the Saturn-Pluto alignments, until you discover Pluto. Like there's something tremendously missing until 1930. And I think like Jung and Pauli you know, they're describing it as a neutral language. Like, what can be a neutral language that can help us synthesize matter and spirit? And that's, again, astrology points towards doing that. I mean, it is the material world, the objective reality of the planetary positions, but what is it speaking to? It's speaking to meaning and the transcendent, and, you know, like bringing in the, I mean, and I think it also, yeah, you can see it as that in that same way, the trajectory of the evolution is fulfilling some type of collective individuation process, like where humanity is differentiated. We've gone out in the hero's journey of the, you know, the last 500 years of the autonomous forging of self, but now this capacity to connect back to the whole, to come back to community of being, but on a cosmic level. And then I think you can understand like the planetary alignments as entangled fields, like actual archetypal fields of, like, in the same way the Higgs boson is a field of energy that all the other particles participate in the Higgs field. That's what allows them to gain mass. And it seems to be the same type of thing where there's an archetypal entanglement between, say, the Saturn-Pluto alignment and the field that it created over 2018 to 2021, and how we are participating in that. It's just like another way of describing it, but it's coherent with our understanding of physics. So yeah, also the collective unconscious, the archetypal unconscious, the anima mundi, all those I just said, it seems like we can recognize the archetypal dimension as an instantiation of those things, and that it brings us into a different type of relationship with it if we can incorporate it. And this, I think, the last thing I'll say is, it also seems to satisfy GEBSER's structures of consciousness, you know, like the archaic, it is the archetypes, it's the origin, but it also like magical, like it's interesting in GEBSER's In the Ever-Present Origin, he says like synchronicity wouldn't exist in the magical structure. Like that was just the way it was, you know, like you're in the magical structure, you're just in that participation, and it doesn't have the same numinosity that it does to us because we live in a disenchanted world where synchronicities happen. It brings in the numinous because we're living in a materialistic projected frame of reference, but it also it clearly recovers the mythic dimension. They are gods and goddesses, but we're using the mental sphere to, you know, how are we aligning or how are we using our imagination to participate with them? And then the full picture would be bringing it in, would be an integral, a perspectival thing that creates a diaphanon where we are able to see through our limited frame of reference, the materialistic worldview, and move into a transcendent, transpersonal perspective that has a capacity to see through things in a new way. And then with Christianity, it also seems like, I think you can see the birth chart as like the planetary symbols are word in a sense. Like, what is a word? It's like, it's an archetype. It has multivalent meanings. And the symbols are like the structure of the chart is a logos. It gives it a structure. But what is it? What do they point towards is wisdom. It's the wisdom in the archetypal meanings and our relationship to them that allows to recover or allows us to engage with them. And what I think was just is like an ongoing process. Like it's something that we will continue to learn from and gain wisdom if we can move our attention towards them in a new way. Yeah, that's it. And last thing I'll say about it is like Bella describes what happens at the axial period as second order thinking, you know, to move into critical self-reflection. And I think what's emerging now in the sense of like a second axial era is the potential to move into some type of third order awareness. I don't know if thinking is the right word because I don't know, I don't like that term really, but that we can like, you know, we're moving into like a new relationship that transcends our second order capacity for just self-reflection, but we're actually thinking with the archetypes rather than being possessed by them or just unconsciously participating with them. We're actually moving into a conscious relationship with them so that we're, you know, striving to see that transparent diaphanon sense that like we become aware of when Mars is transiting in a certain way where it's not just like looking it up on your, you know, looking up the transits. It's like you're cultivating the archetypal eye, like seeing them, being able to recognize them in the world and move into relationship with them in a practiced way. Like, and this is where I think Barfield and Steiner, it's like, I mean, from my limited understanding of them, that they're kind of describing that type of, like, it's like Goetherian, like imaginative engagement, participation with a gnosis, like a wisdom that would be cultivated that transcends our normal kind of modern day mechanistic, materialistic perception on the surface of things.
Yeah, I was thinking actually in Saving the Appearances, Barfield, you know, he talks about, I don't know how fresh it is, but I just looked at it again recently. He talks about alpha thinking, just like thinking about phenomena, you know, like sort of what we're doing in a sort of scientific mode. And then the beta thinking, which is like, I think this is kind of connected with the second order thinking, thinking about thinking,
Right.
thinking about the nature of thinking and collective representations. And then he talks about figuration and the ideal of conscious figuration, which is, I think, also, you know, final participation. So like what you were describing, like, or Tolkien will call it sub-creation, where there's at least when that like almost perception becomes a creative act because you're like tuned in with the flow of the primary imagination in Coleridge's terminology. Anyway, yeah, that's what I was thinking of when you were following up, and I would say totally that's what Barfield and Steiner are gesturing towards.
Yeah, that really resonates. Alpha thinking, beta thinking.
And like what you were describing, because I think actually a couple experiences of mine in non-ordinary states of consciousness, looking up at the sky, I felt like I was participating in the meaning that the appearance was mediating to me in a way that was unlike what I experience in my dim or, you know, ordinary state of consciousness. And so when you were speaking earlier, I was like, yeah, what a beautiful potential.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we're on the threshold potentially of developing that in a conscious way, where it'll be more like the non-ordinary state.
Yeah,
Like yeah,
everything's speaking.
yeah, exactly. Everything is speaking.
In one of his essays, Barfield talks, I think it's imagination and inspiration, and he's talking about like this sort of development, and it's like instead of, and I kind of, yeah, instead of like the being behind the appearance speaking from without, it's like speaking up within us as we behold it.
Exactly.
That,
And I think that's exactly it. Like the archetypes, they're not just in the planets, they're in us. I mean, it's a co-creative process. I mean, we're realizing it within ourselves, and they are like your birth chart, you can't help but to embody it. Like every act and every thought and every action and everything we say is held within it. Like you can't not speak from it because it is within you. But then with the planetary transits, it's another layer of meeting what is already within you and in the process of becoming, that we're engaging with in time in a co-creative participation, which is always happening as well. You can't help but to be within your transits either, but having knowledge of it brings in a whole new capacity for agency, to engage with them, it seems.
Yeah, I love the presentation you just gave, Chad. It's very clear. It's one of the clearest like articulations I've heard you offer, almost like an apology in the sense of like speaking on behalf of something, an apology for astrology. Is very good.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Just connecting with VERVAEKE and Timmy Smin. Like, I'm glad you pulled out those
yeah, that was so cool.
those excerpts, and just the way astrology, archetypal astrology it's an example of an integration of the way of numbers and the way of context. And you got me thinking about like astrology as a kind of semiotics, astrosemiotics perhaps, or sky hermeneutics, or like a way of using geometry, but also using a qualitative sensitivity to meanings, to read the motions of the heavens. And you know, when Ashton was just talking about his experience with the sky, it made me think of something Ralph Waldo Emerson says in Nature. He says, if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night come out these envoys of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smile. Because it's like, we take it for granted, you know, but if you actually just look up and humble yourself to just the sheer fact, just take in the fact of what you're looking at, you know?
Yeah.
And then remember that, like, oh yeah, we can, like, for thousands of years, human beings have understood the patterns which are repeating, and that, you know, these are, it's not just random, right? There's meaning that's permeating us, and that we're inside of that like field of meaningful coincidence. Coincidence. Coincidence makes it seem arbitrary, but it's
Right. Yeah.
like our, we're co inside, you know, that
Perfect.
display. And it's just, we should be more astonished by it. And I think it does do exactly what you're saying. Like, we preserve the individuation while also re-embedding, right?
Mhm.
Being able to see how we are related to the patterns in the heavens. We're not determined, but related, and we can realize our freedom by more closely studying and understanding our own natal charts.
Yeah, and that's great. The freedom aspect, I didn't even think about it exactly in this way, but it's exactly it. It's more freedom because on some level we are unconscious puppets, you know, puppets, but like we're in an unconscious participation
Mhm.
with them without the knowledge. But with the knowledge, you literally do gain more freedom. Like I have Mars square Mercury right now, and a couple of days ago I wrote this Facebook post that like was little shrill, you know, and I was a little angry. It was right after the Putin invaded Ukraine, and I was just like, you know, and but that's the Mars anger, and like rather than you can become aware of that and not be beholden to it and act out in a shrill way. You can focus that energy in a more life enhancing way rather than, you know, and that gives you more freedom. Like, and when what you're saying about like taking it for granted, that's the Barfield describing idolatry, right? It's like we're seeing things as idols on a surface manner rather than breaking through that surface perspective, materialistic perspective, and seeing the numinous dimension of it
Mhm.
of itself.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
just to realize that when you look up and out, you're actually peering into the depths of soul,
that's right.
your own soul, but everyone's soul. It's like, you know, the ancients in like medieval Christendom used to think of the sky as like the gown of Mary, right?
Oh wow,
Or Sophia, but the
Sophia, yeah.
divine feminine,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
Um, I want to make a crude joke about looking up the skirt of, you know, but it's like, it's holy, you know, and it's our source. It's our, it's the womb out of which we come. And we just, how do we cultivate the state of mind to humble ourselves to that? You know, I think that's the real question.
That
Because
is the
we're
question.
so mesmerized by our artificial sources of light, you know, that we forget what's up there.
Yeah.
It seems like the sky is silent because we're so used to the overstimulation of the electronic surrogates.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How do we quiet ourselves enough to hear again what the sky is saying?
That is the question. That is the question. And I guess like going back to Taylor, it kind of depends on how we're capable of articulating it, you know, like bringing voice to the the recognition of what's actually happening. And you know, it is a humbling dimension that particularly the masculine mind has to do, you know, to engage what ultimately is a feminine. I mean, I think it is Sophia, you know, like in the Gnostic, what I was reading up on the Gnostic understanding of Sophia is like she was like the creator of the seven circles, the seven planetary like um,
Vessels? Is that what?
vessels. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like the actual planetary spheres, like which, you know, it even had specifically to relate to astrology in the Gnostic understanding, and that there is a way in which, you know, like like, I guess like in the Jungian sense, what does he say? The confrontation with the shadow is the apprentice piece, which we still are needing to do. Clearly, masculine does in major ways. And but the masterpiece is the confrontation with the anima mundi. And that's the soul of the world. That's what we're describing. And but ultimately, I think it probably comes from the pressing need from culture and timing and history, in the sense of like, we need a meta narrative. Like we're spinning out of control with our own egoic, you know, hubris and shadow projection. And you know, we're also, I think it's pressing in that sense of more than ever, like we need like something, a frame of reference that can unite. And that's another just amazing aspect of astrology, is that it's every human being. Like everyone has a birth chart. Like it's completely democratized. No one is left out. Like that's where I think like the Christian and agape sense of fulfillment is there too, in that sense of everyone's invited to the kingdom. Like no one is, marginalized.
But some charts are better. I'm just kidding. It's just a joke. I don't think that at
Every
all.
chart has nobility, and it reflects your participation. It reflects your experience. It reflects your incarnation. And in that sense reflects everyone as a divine center of logos, like, we're in your own participatory relationship. And it's cross-cultural. Like it transcends language barriers. Like most cultures have some type of astrological understanding of like what their sign is or something, I mean, like that gives me hope as well, that like the universality to it, that allows for more potential for being embraced, for the recognition. And that like also it's not like an alien language, something that you have to learn, that's never, it's something that's within us, that we actually have some intuitive understanding of archetypes, even if we don't understand archetypes at all. Like everyone understands anger, everyone understands like discipline and focus and, backbone and integrity. I mean, those are archetypes, like Saturn, Mars, and like, you see what I'm saying? It's not like something foreign from us. It's something we're almost like, in a Platonic sense, like anamnesis, like remembering what has been lost, what we've forgotten.
Yeah, it is really astrology. Like the planetary archetypes are a psychologos, like the language of the psyche, and it is there for us to experience. And once you learn the language, you gain some perspective on your own experience. Not only can you speak about it, but you can actually see the rhythm and the tempo of the moods and potentials that you're moving through at any given time.
Yep. And the way your life is unfolding in relationship to the whole, like it demarcates those important cyclical periods in your life that are filled with struggle or transformation. And and it gives it meaning in a way that without it, we're just intuiting it, like without any frame of reference on some level. I mean, without any frame of reference, but this provides a cosmic frame of reference.
Yeah. And it strikes me that you could, not only can you see that this would be possible, but historically it is actually the case that, there's Christian astrology and Islamic astrology and various indigenous forms and Vedic forms, etc. of astrology. And so it can be transcultural in the sense that we all live under the same sky, and at least from what I've seen, there are at least, I'm curious about how much agreement there is about the archetypal meaning of certain planets across cultures. Because I think, is it the Mayans who see that for them Venus is the god of war.
Yeah.
And so there's some interesting ways in which we would need to look at various ways of interpreting
Right.
what the planetary archetypes mean.
Yeah. I was actually, I don't know where saw it, but just recently someone was saying that Venus as morning star in particular has more of a warlike dimension, which it is the morning star right now,
Right.
which is
Oh,
interesting.
interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot more. I mean, we're just at the early stages of this threshold that, like of learning, of incorporating, of understanding what it is, like we're at the very early, we're at the dawning moments of a new paradigm, it seems,
Right.
potentially.
Right. I mean, just on this issue though, it strikes me that if archetypal meaning is participatory, then different cultures might be participating with the same archetypal figure in a unique way that calls forth a side of that archetype that other cultures just don't really know as well.
Absolutely.
You know, it's
Absolutely.
like individual people, the nature of the human personality is such that depending who we're hanging out with, a different side of us comes out,
Right.
So the Mayans were hanging out with Venus and this other side came out and we don't.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it does seem that way. It seems like it's an enacted participation. It's something that is brought forth through our enaction of it, or through the participation. And yeah, cultural dependent in that sense. It completely makes sense. But then at the same time, there's universality too, of cultures as well. I mean, not entirely, but
Yeah, there are a lot of
there's a lot of
similarities across
similarities.
cultures with the planetary meanings. Yeah, more than you would think if it was just culturally relative.
Right, right. Um, but yeah, but like, I mean, reading, I guess, about the Aboriginal culture is just amazing. Like, just unbelievable what their worldview is. That like relative to the Western frame of reference. I mean, they live in this dreaming. The dream time is like the law. It like it's their archetypal meta narrative. I mean, I have no idea how astrology would line up in their culture per se, because it's so radically different than ours. As far as that seems like the most radical different culture that I'm aware of, and that maybe there's others, but as far as Western
Do they
identity,
have an? I mean, I'm sure they have some myth and practice associated with
I
the sky
imagine
and
so.
the.
I don't know anything about it though.
Hmm,
Yeah,
be interesting.
it would be
Curious to
very,
look into
very
that.
interesting. Yeah, totally. They clearly live in an enchanted worldview. Like it's already in our space. They live in a collective, enchanted, numinous relationship to the earth, to themselves, to the cosmos in some way. I mean, I don't know exactly what that is, but it's clearly still enchanted after 30, 40,000 years. I mean, it's amazing. It's totally amazing that they've held their culture together in relatively the same way, for so long,
Hmm.
just orally. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like, but
Hmm.
you know, I I'm I'm hopeful that like we can break out of this mechanistic, materialistic perspective. And hearing Eastman and the reading just a little bit that I read in the past 2 days, I'm really heartened by the fact that I mean, do you think, I want to hear what you think about this, is like, because am I hearing it right when they seem to be kind of in that last talk, like kind of reaching for an archetypal meta narrative, some like a meta narrative, but then eternal objects is providing novelty, like the relationship, I mean, am I hearing them correctly? Like they're kind of thirsting for that. I don't know.
Yeah. Um, I think it is the mechanistic materialistic view is actually I think pretty much
It's destroyed.
destroyed at this point from a scientific point of view,
Mhm.
and that doesn't mean that there aren't some scientists and philosophers who are holding on for dear life to a dead worldview, because for reasons that we know,
It's
it
convincing.
is convincing, and it's morally inspiring to feel like you're like just a hero lost in a stormy sea that has no meaning, and you're like brave enough to face it, you know. And
Yeah, it's an existential sort of
yeah,
absurd, but live anyway.
right. But there are more scientists, more and more, like Tim Eastman, who are who understand physics. He's a plasma physicist, right? And he understands quantum theory, and he's describing how it allows us to understand, you know, coherence of physical relations at astronomical scales. I mean, pretty clear what he's gesturing towards there. And he mentions Jung and Pauli and the research they did on synchronicity, and so it's these sorts of what he calls global
Right.
relations, non-locality, in other words.
Yeah.
It's established
Right.
science, you know, and there's a little bit of hesitance, maybe understandably so, to rush to interpret what it might mean for human experience and the relationship between psyche and cosmos. But I think the door is wide open, you know, and there are plenty of good books written on these sorts of things that people will find. And so I think it's accelerating this worldview shift. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is the way like I've interpreted it through quantum theory. Is it's an entangled relationship. Entanglement is, you know, they're entangled fields, you know, and we're in a participatory relationship with them, and it the global, non-local, spooky action at a distance. That's what's happening. It's an instantiation of that on some level, of the wholeness of our relationship to the cosmos, you know,
Mm-hmm.
at global
Right.
scale.
Yeah. Um, I think we should
Yeah.
probably wrap up here pretty soon. Do either of you want to offer any closing thoughts?
Pray for Ukraine,
Yes, definitely.
for Putin, and, you know, hopefully some sanity, some like clarity of soul. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to imagine him like healing in some way, but
Yeah, I just hope
I,
he finds a way out of the corner he's backed
exactly.
himself into and been, to some extent, pushed. But
Right.
how do we? Yeah, I just pray for peace, and um, that the loss of life is ceases as soon as possible.
Yeah.
The needless loss of life.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Chad, very
Yes.
much for sharing these ideas with us.
Awesome. I really appreciate the feedback. Thanks.
It was awesome.
Yeah.